There we go. So class 4. Um, Good news, we only had one chapter this time, even though it talked about a little bit more stuff, because it talked about 2 different loops. But we're definitely going to overview loops and then more examples. So at the end of this, the big things are iteration. That is a key word that you do need to know what it means. So when you're talking about iteration, that's just repeating something over and over. So iteration to repeat the execution of a code block. That's your for and while loops. And then properly write for and while loops. Hopefully we'll be able to do that. And then know when we're supposed to use for versus while loops. So repeating with these loops, iteration again is a key word. I think in there they talked about keeping your code dry, which is don't repeat yourself. So if you're going to do something over and over again, you might as well put it in a loop rather than coding that several times. We're talking about for loops, accumulators. So if you're trying to accumulate some things, you write that in a loop and you can actually accumulate. While loops, and then which loop should you use? So iteration, again, it's the dry method is don't repeat yourself. So these are the reasons why you might use iteration. So if you want to process a collection, meaning in our context, if you have an array and you want to do stuff in an array, so you want to go through each item and do something to it or calculate something or print it off. Anytime you're using a collection, oftentimes you'll start using iterations or loops. Let's say that you want to extract data from a CSV file. So this is something I was doing before. CSV files have rows. So then you can put rows into a collection and then you can iterate over them. Parse object from an API. We have not talked about APIs in this course, but that is something that I just want to throw that vocabulary out there. So whenever you see it later, you'll kind of at least have been heard of it. But an API is whenever you make a call to another program and then you get some information. Sometimes those objects aren't returned in the way that you want. So you might put it in a loop to kind of go over those things to do what you want to do to those objects. We have seen asking a user some question. And then more specifically on this one, until you get it correct. So something in the live coding I'll do is the guessing game. It's a very common thing you program as a beginner. And it's also good to automate regular tasks. So you can just go over the task over and over. So whenever we're talking about for loops, I think most of these examples came straight from the textbook this time. So let's say that I wanted to print out all the numbers from 0 to 50. I could do that in 50 lines of code, or I can do it in 3. So instead of printing all of them, do the for loop. The basic for loop, when you guys are doing this, this is what I call the template. So this is what it should look like. You're going to initialize your first expression. Most of the time for us, that's that let I equal 0. It doesn't always have to be. And then you say, how do you want to loop things? Like, when is the end of this loop going to happen? And then each time you loop, you're going to update that expression again. And then the loop body is just your code. So I have a couple different examples here. So just for mental stuff, let's try to figure out what each of these will do really, really quick. So if I said let I equal 10, and you're going to keep going as long as I is greater than 1, a negative 1. And then on each loop, you're going to decrease I by 1. So that means the first time it's 10, and then it's going to decrease, and then it's 9. 9's still greater. Then it's going to be 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. But a good thing that was brought up in some of the homework help stuff was, should I use this greater than -1, or should I be using a greater than and equal to? So just remember, if you use an equal to, it will run that exact number. If you don't use the equal to, it'll bump up to it, but it won't use that. Meaning, I could have done in this one greater than or equal to 0, but this one I did greater than -1. It ends the same way. I'll explain a little bit more during that live coding on that. But so on number 2 down here in the bottom left, so we have launch code. This is hopefully an easier one. We go from 0 to length. I only say easier because I think you've seen it a few times in the examples. So whenever I log, I'm going to take my array, which is name, and remember my name is LaunchCode, and I'm going to go through the index I. So it's 0 first. So it'd be name 0. So name 0 is the L, because that starts at 0, and then it goes 1, 2, etc. But here's the weird one on this one. When I update, I'm actually not printing every single one. I said, don't update all of them. I want to print, yeah, it turns out to be every other one. So it'd be 0, but it would skip 1. It'd be 0 plus 2, which is 2. So it would print out the L. And then because it would skip over the 1, 0 plus 2 is 2. 2 plus 2 is 4. So it actually prints out every other letter here. And then this other one, the reason I did this is for the equal sign to show you, just to explicitly state, you're going to print out launch code, but you're not going to print out all of it, I think. You're going to start at 0 and then do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so then the question is, does it print out the O, or does it stop right before the O? And I think that it would include the O because of the equal sign. Yep. Good question on this little simplified thing here. You cannot do I plus 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 or plus plus 2, but you could do, the shortcut is I plus equals 2. And if I'm in live coding and somebody reminds me, I'll show that live. Oh, wrong. But again, I'm going to go through these super quick because I think most of you, by the way you guys are responding, understand this. So if I did launch code and I did the whole entire length this time, it would print out all of launch code, but they would be on separate lines. So remember that the console log does 1 per line. If I did all the languages and I had an array and I went through the whole entire length, it would print this. So then the question is, with that equal sign, because that's where a lot of people get concerned. This is the reason why it's more typical not to have the equal sign, because I don't want to have to do equals length minus 1. So if you're doing an array, you'll usually see just the less than, not the less than or equal to sign. When you're doing straight numbers, I can see it both ways. So either way works. Accumulator. So we talked about accumulating things. This is that plus equals. So if I have a total, instead of saying total equals total plus I, that's that shortcut, shorthand for that. But let's go through number 1 here. So we start at 6. The total is 0. So we're going to let, it says I equals 1. So again, we don't always have to start at 0. We get to assign this however we want to. So I'm going to start at 1. And then I'm going to say, as long as I is less than or equal to n, and remember n is always 6, but my I is going to change by 1 each time. So at first it's going to be 1, then it's going to be 2, then it's going to be 3, 4, 5, and 6. That's what I is going to be. But each time my total is going to add it. So it's going to be 1 plus 2, so it's actually going to be 3, plus 3, which is 6, plus 4, which is 10. Do you see how it's accumulating each of those each time? We can do that, the same kind of thing with letters. You guys were struggling a little bit with this on your exercise of being able to reverse the letters. I will, in live coding, show you a few different ways to do that. But let's say we had blue and we kind of wanted to reverse it. I could say, let I equal 0 and go to the length. So that's going to be 4, but it's not going to include the index of 4. It'll be actually the index of 3. And then this is where some people saw this in the book. If I do the reverse, usually you're seeing the reverse plus the string. But if you notice here, it's actually the string plus reverse. So whenever I do this one, my reverse is blank at first. And then this is B plus blank is still B. So that one's probably fine. But now that my reversed is B, I'm going to do the next letter. So my B is going to be on this side, and my L is actually going to be on this side. So the order of this addition, this concatenation, actually matters. If you are accumulating, you're almost always overriding your previous one. That's just kind of by definition. That it depends on your case on whether you want to do that or not. But yeah. Yeah, and I'll definitely show some other ways to do this. So yes, I will. That specific one I'll show in lab coding. So on this thing here, this is the same thing here. As I go through, I take the 2 and I add it to my total. So my total is 2, and now my next number is -5. So I add -5, and then the next time it's 13, and I'm going to add the 13, etc. As you go through those. That's that accumulator. Okay. There are other types of for loops that are not in the book. If you have an array, so again, this is not in book. So if you're struggling with arrays, this is a page that you don't have to look at. I'm just going to talk about it real quick, and then you can, and then we'll keep going on. But this is I call it for each. So it's for each variable in the array, do something. So for instance, for these numbers, I could say let x in numbers. And what this would do is the same thing. It will not do an I. So you cannot use the index. It's the problem. So let x in numbers, and then you're going to iterate through. So just throwing those out there. Not going to go over it. So the while loop. These are in the book. So let's go over these. The while loop. This is your for loop. These can be used for the same purposes. So this example here is the same thing. The console log, if you see the console log, this is the actual execution of code that's going on. It's inside the loop. But if you see here, my initialization usually happens before the loop. So you do have to initialize something, or else it won't know what you're talking about. And then you're going to continue on for this, and then increase it by that. So you can actually, most loops can go back and forth and be written either way. The difference is if there's a fixed number, such as like this 51 and 0, you're going from 0 to 51. If there's a fixed thing like that, most people will write the for loop. I do see the while loops in production sometimes. And usually whenever I do, I also hear somebody complaining, why did somebody do this for a while loop when they could have done it in a for loop? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Here's an example from the book. So if you have, we're accepting some input. You're going to enter in a positive number. And so it's going to take your number, and then it's going to translate it into a number. Hopefully, you guys are getting good enough that you're actually not putting these on 2 separate lines anymore. You're going to put them all on the same line. You're going to put this number right in front of that input and wrap this whole thing in numbers, so it's all one line. It looks more clean. More people would like that. And then what I'm going to do is, while this number is less than or equal to 0, I'm going to ask them again. I'm going to say, hey, you didn't put in a positive number like I asked, so I'm going to ask you again. So I'm going to ask you, and then it's going to evaluate it again. If the number of this number is less than or equal to 0, it's going to say invalid input, and it's just going to keep asking you over and over until this is false. So that's the other slight difference. For loops, we usually are thinking about the true version, where while we're often thinking about the truth on the inside, but the false is when we break out of it. This one down here, you will come across these when you are programming yourself. Does anybody see a problem with this section of code down here? Yeah, many of you are responding. This
It's
will
not
result
iterating.
in an infinite loop. This stuff happens all the time when I'm looking at code. Um, it's fine. You go through this. Sometimes you're just going fast and you're not really thinking about. There's so many things to think about when you're programming because you have to be so detail oriented. Something like this could easily be forgotten that you actually need to increment your I value, or else your I will always be 0. So this will print 0 infinitely. Right. Um, did the book go over breaks? I can't remember. Yeah. Okay. So another thing that I see, I don't. There are definitely cases that I have used breaks, no doubt, but it's not my go-to because if I can write this in a different way, then I will. A perfect example of a break, though, is whenever you are trying to search for a value, because as soon as you hit that value, you don't want to go anymore. Another way you can do this instead of break is to make your thing here say if search equals false, and then inside here say search equals true. So once you hit the search value, it's called like a one-way flag is what I've heard of it called. So you kind of set this thing and say, have I found my search value? And that's false. And then if you find it, you say that that's true now. And then the next time it evaluates, it'll break out of it because it's now true. I've seen that way, but I didn't hear anybody have questions on the break part, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. But it does break out of the loop. All right, getting close to the lecture part because I want to do a lot of live coding. So main thing is for for loop, whenever there's a definite iteration, meaning you know what you're iterating over. So if you have an array, I'd probably use a for loop because you know how many items you have in the array. And even if you don't know the exact number, you can do array.length and the computer can find that out for you. So for loop is perfect for those. And that's the same thing with a collection. Anytime you have a collection, you want to go over every single item. A for loop is probably best. The reasons you'd use a while loop is when you don't know when you might end. Did the user input it right the first time, or did it take them 10 times to finally input it in correctly? If you're doing a guessing game, do you know how many times it's going to take for them to guess the number? So oftentimes, when you're dealing with user stuff, you're going to do a while loop, and you're going to have that validation in there, where a for loop is usually for already pre-configured things that you know how to handle. Right. There's also this other weird loop. Somebody mentioned it, and that's called a do while loop. So I gave you an example right here. I'm not going to go over it too much because it's not something you have to know. But a do while loop actually does this code action one time before it gets evaluated. So instead of doing the while, so on a while loop, it checks it, and if it doesn't meet it right at the beginning, it skips over the whole entire code in the middle, where a do will do it the first time and then keep going. I do see this a little bit more on kind of front-end development because it is more user focused. So if I'm asking the user for input, this would be a perfect time to actually do a do while loop when you're asking for input, because that first time they're going to have to enter input for you to check if it's valid or not. So this is perfect that you run the input, you check, and then you keep checking afterwards if needed. All right. So we talked about iteration. I know this is super quick because I do want to get to live coding. Iteration, repeat over code block. You can do for and while loops, and hopefully I did a decent job. I know I went super fast through it of when you would use a for and a while loop. Yeah, so somebody's given examples of if you know that you only want something to run 3 times, like asking the user 3 times for their password, and then you're done, then you'd want a for loop instead of a while loop. Some expectations. I usually put this at the end and then sometimes forget. So I'm going to go over some housekeeping things and then we'll go to live coding. Remember, time, you want to put in the attendance code that's given during studio, and then you want to finish your studio before signing off for the night. These are in a perfect world, you're putting in your attendance code and getting your studio done tonight. Now, if you want to do the bonus mission, sometimes you'll want to work on that the next couple of days and figure that out. That's fine. But I'm just saying, like, the expectation is getting that done today. Your reading and exercises before the next class. So I think we have a function is the next thing we're going to be talking about. And then I don't know why. Yeah, that's today, isn't it? So due tonight, you have a graded assignment part 2. Does that sound right? At midnight? Okay. I think I heard that the IAs are going to do the studio, and then you're supposed to schedule time with them, but I bet you Jamarco will do that towards the end. He will be joining us closer to 7 and going over those. I'm going to do some live coding. Yep. As I'm switching over, I'm going to take a glance at the questions. Also, I was doing stuff before and I forgot to reset. Right. Some things in the chat that I'm seeing. Okay. Great question. I'm going to type this out. Is this big enough, or do I need to zoom in one more? So some people are giving me thumbs up. Please. It always depends on your screen size. Like mine is super big. So I will zoom in 1. There we go. Not doing any more than that. Get those wonderful glasses out. So question was, what's the difference between, if I don't know what a string is going to be yet, if I just do let string equals blank, or can I just do let string? So the question is, which of these is best? I can tell you if you don't, like, as a beginner, I would always try to do this top one first, or actually setting it, either one of these. As a beginner, I would hesitate telling you to use that middle one of just letting string without putting something in it. And the main reason why, if the first time that gets used, it is not set before it gets used, it'll throw a big error. And so we don't want that. So oftentimes you should know kind of what it is at the beginning. So if you don't, such as if I'm asking for a user input and I know that the input is going to happen before it's ever being used or printed or checked or any of those things, you could do let string or let user input and then just don't assign anything to it. And then pretty much a couple lines down, you're going to say user input equals, and then you ask them a question. That is fine, but I usually see it actually getting used, declared, instantiated first. What loop do professionals use most in production? If you can use a for loop, I do for loops. Otherwise, while loops. And there are times you can use either one. I also think that it depends on kind of what you're used to. I'm going to be very honest. You'll see this when talking to other IAs. Some of our IAs are front-end developers, so they're working with JavaScript and more front-end things. I am more of a back-end developer, so Java is my main language. I deal with other things, but Java is my core. I use for loops because in a back-end language, I'm dealing with computers and not a lot of user input. I'm making my front end do all that validation. So when you're talking about user validation, you might see more whiles. So I do see a little bit more whiles on the front end, where on the back end, I usually see more for loop because I know what I'm getting. Also, it was brought up somewhere, so this might be a good time to talk about it. The difference between a tightly strictly typed language versus kind of a loosely typed language. So Java, the one that I'm used to, is very very strict, meaning this is, if I wanted to declare this, I can't declare it like this. I have to purposely say that this variable is of type string, and I cannot set it to anything else but a string forever. Like once I say what type it is, that's strictly type, meaning I'm saying it's a string and it will be a string forever. That's how strict type languages work, like Java. Loosely typed ones, like JavaScript and Python, I can set this as a string right now, and then I can go set it as a number, and then I can go set it as a Boolean, and then I can go set it as a different object. I can go set it to be whatever I want to, and JavaScript doesn't care at the time. It just cares at the runtime. When it runs and it hits that thing, can it do what it needs to do? So that's where that for and while is kind of similar. I see the people that are more, loosely, I'm going to do a while loop and I'll just break out of it, where I'm very, very structured. So I want a for loop and I want to structure as much as I can. So it's kind of like a different philosophy. So what was the command that I used to comment this code? So whenever in VS Code and in IntelliJ, when we get there, if you hover or if you highlight any lines of code and you do control \, so I'll type it out so you can see. If you type this control, as you hold control, you hit this, which is right near the control, it'll comment out your code. So if I just hover over it, I hold control, hit that, it'll go back and forth between commenting out my code and not. I do that all the time. Any more little things before we? Yeah, I'll definitely go over some exercise examples, and hopefully if I have time, I'll ask you if there's any specific ones that I didn't go over. Right. I'm gonna keep going. So some things, I made these comments for me at the top. So something that I want to talk about is how do I add this read line sync into my stuff? Because several of you noticed that your while loops needed, I think it required this, but I don't know if LaunchCode did put the package JSON in here for you. So whenever you were trying to do npm install, it didn't install anything because it didn't know what you wanted to install, because it didn't have that package, that JSON package.json. So some people said the first thing you need to do is do npm init. I'm going to type it out and I want to talk about it. So I'm in the appropriate thing. I'm in loops and exercises. That's this folder here, loops, exercises. So some people said, this is what you need to do, npm init. And that means to initialize a node project. That's what you're doing. And if I run this, it will create that package.json. And there are some benefits to that. It'll set up the package part of it. It'll tell me to name it. It'll ask me some questions. And whenever you are actually running a bigger node package, that is what you have to do to set all that stuff up. I like to run the fewest amount of commands that I want to. So yeah, and if you do Y, it avoids all the questions. Because this is just for fun and I'm just playing around with things, I actually don't run that command. I just start typing what I want to install. So if it was me, I would have went straight to this. So it said that readline sync was not in there. I'm going to say npm install readline sync. My package JSON's not here. My node modules is not over here. But if I run this, it will install that one thing. It'll go ahead and add the package.json, that lock package, and it'll install the node modules for you. So if you run the npm init, it still doesn't know to install this package. So I think that was the confusion, is if you run npm init, all that does is tell node, this is a package, pay attention to it. But it doesn't install anything. You still have to manually install the packages that you want. So the difference is whenever I open up this package.json, it's telling now if I do npm install with nothing, it'll install these dependencies. But what it does not have in there is all the package stuff. Let me see if I can find a good example. I might have deleted all of them. So a normal package, like if you do an init, it'll have all this other stuff in it, like the author, the license. But do you see how the dependencies are still there? So if you just do the install, it'll install the dependencies, but it won't give you all of this other stuff and set it up like a big node project. I don't care about that, so I don't run it. Yeah. So there's multiple ways to do it. I'm just trying to show you what I would do is the quickest, in my opinion. If something is not installed, just install it. Now, if you ran this and it already had if you just run this, even if it has a package.json, it'll just add it to it. So you can always just run this. So I got that one done. I also I was reading through somewhere, and somebody was saying, well, why don't we just use prompt sync? And here's my 2 cents on it. It does the same exact thing, but you have to do some of your input slightly different. For instance, I think I have it down here somewhere. Yeah, prompt. Instead of doing input.question, you just do prompt. It still does the same thing, and I'll go over that, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It doesn't give you any benefit to using this one instead of the other one. If LaunchCode would have said to use this one instead of readline sync, then we would be using this one and not the other one. It does not matter. And okay. Again, before I get into the live coding of this, these are all these housekeeping items that people have been asking. I'm going to show you some VS Code things. I am going to get a little bit bigger here because I don't need to code anything right this second. There we go. Even bigger. Off to the left, and I don't know why some of you have it off to the right. I think that's weird, but you do you. But here's the Explorer here. This will give me all of my files that are in my project. The search will allow me to search. We haven't really done much of that. But I want to draw your attention to this source control. In the source control, it tells me that I have almost 7,000 changes right now. And several of you noticed this whenever you did the studio on Thursday. When you installed that test package called Jest, it installed thousands of files for you. All of those files were inside the node_modules directory. And nobody else needs to have those, because at worst, if they want to run that program, they just do npm install and it'll do that for them. So common practice is we do not include anything in any node modules directory when we push it to Git. That's very common practice. So we need to make sure that we don't do that. So I'm actually going to give you guys like 60 seconds. If you want to pull up, if you don't already have your Java project, and you need to have JavaScript project as the root. So yours should look just like mine. It should say Explorer, and JavaScript project should be at the root here. I'm going to stay inside of that, so I'm going to leave that. Yeah. So JavaScript project is the root. I'm going to give you guys 60 to 90 seconds or so. If you don't already have this up, pull this up, because I'm going to have you actually add something into your .gitignore file, and I'll explain it as I go. I'm going to look for questions while you guys are doing that. A good question that you guys can continue working on. Trevor asked, should the package .json files be pushed up to Git? And that actually they should, because those are the dependencies that you're telling other people they need to install before running your program. So you will always see those pushed up to Git, because that's just telling everybody else what they need to install. But that's why Node has the npm install, which then installs it for them. So I don't know exactly the exact answer that you're looking for, but to make JavaScript projects be my bottom one, I go to File. Hopefully you have opened it at that point before. And if you have, you can do Open Recent. And then it's this JavaScript project, so not the one that's inside. So you can see here, it goes inside data and variables and chapter examples, whatever else, but you're looking for the one that just ends at JavaScript project. If you have done that ever. If you have never opened it up in that directory, then you're going to have to go to File Explorer and find it. So like, I know where mine's at. Mine's in Homework, JavaScript Projects. And then I'm going to open up this. So you'll have to search for it. The question is, what if you just discard all those? Then it will also discard all of the code that you changed as well. You don't want to do that. I'm going to keep going here. This is recorded, so if you need to go back to it, well, good luck finding the timestamp on this, but I'm telling you in here. So to make sure that it's not putting all of this stuff in here, see all these jests and browser, if you see inside this node modules right there, node modules right there, node modules right there, all of these node modules that I've been accumulating, I don't want to save them up to GitHub. So in my Explorer, I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom. So underneath all the other ones. So again, my loops is up here. I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom. The .gitignore that's already in my JavaScript project, I'm going to open this up. And there should be this .ds store. I used to know what this means. I never use it, so I don't really know what it means anymore. But for those of you that, I'm going to tell you the final answer, but I'm also going to walk you through this. If I just did node underscore modules, this only looks inside my JavaScript project, and it would ignore the node modules that's only in this one thing. Well, I don't have a node modules in here, so this wouldn't help me at all. If you do the 1 star before it, the wildcard that says go one file inside, one directory inside. So this would cover some of them, but if you do the 2 wildcards before, this will go through any subdirectory, no matter if it's 2 levels deep or 10 levels deep. It will go through all subdirectories and it will ignore, because that's what we're putting it in. Hey, ignore these things. It will ignore all of these folders and anything in them. And I don't know, I have autosave on, and as I typed this, I don't know if you noticed, but my number over here went from almost 7,000 to 25. Now, I have not committed any of my code since day one. So yours should be actually lower than 25. It should be like 5 or 6 or something, because hopefully you committed your other one. But when I look over here, there's no more node modules. There's still the package.jsons. Those are fine. So just throwing that out there. If you don't want to have to save all these node modules. Now, the other question is, well, what if I already did that? It's not going to hurt anything. So if you've already did the studio last week and you push that huge node module thing up, that's fine. You're going to have to do another test suite in a different studio today. So hopefully you'll put this in there so you're not pushing another 7,000 files up. So, yep. Perfect. I'm not going to commit mine. Another question was asked to me when dealing with Git. This has not been told to you because I don't want you to always use this, but you could put in your message like finish chapter 9 and spell it better than me, but if you hit this commit, it'll actually commit this code for you. And if you come over here and do commit and push, it'll actually commit and push your code for you. So there are ways, IDEs, your development environment, I forgot what the I stood for right off the top of my head, but your development environment like IntelliJ and VS Code have GUI stuff for people so that it makes it a little quicker. I'm letting you know right now, though, you need to get very comfortable with using Git in the terminal so that later on, whenever we add more Git stuff, you feel comfortable. Yeah, integrated, there we go. So yes, you can do it here if you want to go fast, but definitely get used to the commands in the command line. Okay, let me go back. I did the node modules to git ignore. Okay, another question was, do we always have to use the word let before initializing a variable, like declaring a variable? Not, and the answer is in JavaScript, if you don't put let in there, it will default to let. And so if you want to do a constant rather than a let, which I don't think we've really talked about a lot, in JavaScript, if you get away with the I equals 0, it'll let you get away with it. I would not do that. You need to get very comfortable in assigning your variables. JavaScript is trying to become a very user-friendly, user-friendly language. So it's letting you get away with some shortcuts that it can be harmful to you later whenever you're trying to do other stuff. So I would just get used to writing it, being more explicit so that later you aren't going to mess anything up. So just get used to writing the let. JavaScript does allow you to get away with it. So that's my little 2 cents. And then the question, somebody did remind me, if I do let I equals 0 here, and then immediately say let I equals 0 here, do you see how it tells me that there's an error? It says I is declared, oh, that's never read. I cannot redeclare a variable. So this is where I actually like using let, because it'll tell you, oh, do you already have a variable? Because I already assigned a variable up here. It does let you, if you go inside of a loop or an if statement, hopefully this will work the way that I think it should. Yeah, so this one's the weird one, and we haven't talked about global versus local variables or scopes of variables yet, like where do they actually work? But whenever I say let I equals 0 here, I'm using this I right here, but as soon as I go inside here, I can actually set variables with the same exact name inside things. And then it gets very confusing because anytime I use I inside this, it's using this I. Whenever I'm going outside of this, it'll use this I. And that's where we get very confused in our own code. So long story short, always use let to declare variables. Secondly, always be very descriptive in your variables and try not to use the same variable name in the same file. Yeah, so when I was talking about like that, like working memory, well, it writes it into a different section. Yeah, it kind of like sections off memory. So all the memory inside here, as soon as it gets out of the if statement, all the memory inside here goes away of the if statement. It's like a like garbage collection, and they do things so that, if you're running thousands of lines of code, anytime they know that something is inside of an if statement, if it's only used inside the if statement, it throws it away. If you redeclare it up here, then and it saves it on the bigger global scale, then it keeps it, but anything on the inside, it technically throws away. I'm going a little too deep into that. Sorry. All right, and I briefly mentioned this, but just to throw it out there again, if you have an array.length, I almost always see this without the equal sign, so that I'm not writing extra -1s at the end and being explicit. On the other hand, you'll even see me, if I know that it's going to stop at 50, why am I going to say less than 51? Why don't I just say less than or equal to 50? So it just depends on what you're doing. Does it matter? Absolutely not. It's for readability and understanding. And I think that most people will understand this better whenever you're dealing with arrays. But if you're saying stop at 50, a lot of people would do the less than or equal to 50 because you are explicitly saying it. Personal preference. Right. Last thing before I get, this is a long list, before I get into the actual coding for and while loops. Graded assignment. I'm not going to go into the actual specifics that much of the graded assignment, but I was going to pull up and show some common problems. Maybe this one. Actually, I'm not going to do that one. Let's do this one. Yeah, I think it's this one. Right. Many of you, whenever you're running your tests, hopefully this does exactly what I want. The common question that I saw several times that is easy to fix is test 8 and test 10. Those are the only two that I'm going to go over in this lecture because I saw the same thing going over and over again. So I just want to call those two out. Okay? This is another thing to talk. I know that you're not supposed to talk about specific answers of graded assignments, but when I see I'm having a problem with test 7, or if I'm having a problem with whatever, I look at those things and I kind of keep a tally. And if I only see it once, I just ignore it. But when I see the same person or several people asking the same stuff, then I tend to pay attention to it. So that's where this came from. So test 8 and test 10. Not only am I going to show you how to fix these two tests, but I'm also going to show you my thought process for any test. So I think even if you've already fixed these, listen through how I think through how to fix these tests, because I'm like, whenever I run it in terminal, it asks me the questions, it allows me to answer them, and everything looks perfect. So why are these tests failing? So I'm at that point. If you're, every day, you programmed it correctly because it's working when you type in the questions and answers and it works, but it's still not passing the test. That's where I'm coming from mentally right now. And this test 8, this is not something that Node or JavaScript actually prints does. This is something that LaunchCode put in the description of this test to give you an idea about what the test is. So some people were like, it doesn't have a trailing space. So I went through all of my questions and they have a trailing space. Why is this an issue whenever everything has a trailing space? And so I would go through here and I would fix the trailing space. Oh, I might have one that doesn't have a trailing space there. So I'll fix that. And so I fixed all the trailing space and it still doesn't work. So whenever I run this again, yeah, it still doesn't work. But I have all the trailing space there. So don't just look at the description because some person, not a computer, put this in there. The computer is testing what's inside of there. So if you scroll down to test 8, this is where you're starting to figure out what is the computer looking for. The computer says that what it expected and what it got is different. That's what it's meaning right here. All this is the same. What it expected and what it got were different. Well, what did it expect? it expected this thing right here. And it did not get that. So if I scroll down a little bit further, it says that it expected this one. And if I look in my code, and it looks almost the same, but right here, if I notice real closely, there's a space in between the star and the 10, and I don't have a space in between the star and the 10. The computer cares about every single character that's in here. So that one little thing is going to be a problem. The fastest way to solve this for both 8 and 10, I'm just going to copy what they expect, whether it's up here or down there, whatever it is, it has to be in green. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste it right inside here. And then I'm going to rerun my test. And it still failed. So I'm going to go back up to 8. And I'm going to look again. And I know my scrolling is really fast. I'll slow down once I get to where I need to. So test 8. Did I not save it? Come on. I am expecting it to throw me another error, but that's not the one I'm expecting. Oh, I scrolled up too far. So it says 9 passed. So it says I'm good now. Now it says test 10. So the same thing on test 10. When I see test 10, it says that it should be true. But if you look here, what I actually have is true, but I don't have it exactly the way it wants. So I'm just going to copy and paste this true into my true. And hopefully you're seeing how I'm actually using these tests to help. This won't always work, but it works whenever your string, when it's looking for a very specific string and yours isn't copied and pasted the exact way it wants, this will work every time. So it won't work for every test, but for this one it will. When I rerun this, it'll look good. The other thing, since I'm right here, in the book, if you copied and pasted, I think this is going to be a 3 without quotes. So in the book, it does have a typo where all of your correct answers should have quotes around them. So just making sure that everybody's aware of that. And that's, I think, all the help I'm going to do. There we go, 10 pass. So, right. If you have other questions than that, I can definitely help out, or your IAs, or I think are your first stop for those. But I just wanted to throw out, if you guys have common errors that you guys are seeing, I don't mind going over. I can't go over the logic part of it, but I can go over the syntax part of it sometimes. So, anyway, done with that one. Oh, I closed out of all of it. I think I'm ready for actual live coding here. All right. Again, I'm going to have both prompt input and in one place I have a prompt. And so if you guys see that, just know that I'm throwing out this, that it still works, just a different thing. So the first question that we're going to go over, there was this problem in the example of print each character of the string in reverse order to a new line. So most of you saw the answer in the book, but several of you were asking great questions. And it would be something similar to this. Instead of thinking about and like making it actually go backwards, can I make my for loop go backwards? And that's exactly what I would do here. I would let my I, if I know I'm going to go backwards, be the largest one. So the largest index is actually the length -1. That's where I'm going to start at. And then I'm going to say, keep going until you're getting equal to 0. So until you're at the beginning, and then go backwards. So this is, I think this is my favorite way. Another way, Sorry, somebody's coming home, so my dogs are going nuts. All right. On this way too, you could start at the string length. The problem is that's too far. So you could make it just go one less than the string length inside. Again, not my favorite way. But I've seen some of these as I've been teaching, and this will work. So instead of doing the -1 at the beginning, you do the -1 on the inside. And then lastly, what if I don't want my for loop to go backwards? This is probably my second favorite way. I don't like this middle way, but this one, I think it's very unique thinking. On this one, my I is going to be 1, and I'm actually going to go up to the string length, just like normal. And then I'm going to increase the I each time. But if you see the arithmetic that's inside here, I'm taking my string length, which, how many? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So there's 10 characters there. I'm taking 10 minus 1, which is 9. And then the next time I'm increasing this, so it'd be 10 minus 2, and then 10 minus 3. And it's actually going decreasing order, but it's because I'm taking my max minus each iteration. So all three of those ways work. My favorite, again, is the first one, where if you know you're going to go backwards, just start at the biggest one and do the I minus and go backwards by 1 each time. That's my favorite. So hopefully that could clear up a little bit on that one. The evens and odds, another fun one. So this doesn't, oh yeah. All right, I was also showing some people some things. Sorry, so I'm cleaning up my code. All right, I think a lot of people got this one correct, but some people said that they wanted it explained a little bit better. So I have an array, has all these numbers. I'm going to do my for loop. I don't think anybody had a problem with the for loop. You're going to start at the 0th element, which is the first element, and you're going to keep going for the length of the array. So it's going to see 2, and then it's going to do 3, and then it's going to do 13, et cetera, all the way through. So most people were okay with the for loop. It was this evaluation. So I wanted to make sure that we understood data types. This is the most important thing. So if I do something like this, other array is an array, and if I hover over it, you can see that it has the brackets over words. So the array, I can't really divide or do the modulus to. So I have to say, well, what element inside the array, which is going to be that first element inside the array, then the next element, et cetera. So I think some people are still good there. There are some people that are still a little stuck on this modulus. So I'm just going to write something here on the screen so you can see it. If I do 10 mod 3, this is going to give me 1. I'm not just making up numbers there. What this does, if you go back to, like, I don't know, 3rd grade, when they did long division and you had to write out, and you would do 10 and you'd put the square looking thing or whatever, and you'd put the 3 on the outside, and then you divide it, and then at the end you had to say, after you did all your subtraction and all that stuff, at the very, very bottom there was your remainder at the end of long division. That's what this does. This is the remainder. So no matter how big my number is, if I divide it, I'm not actually looking for the number how many times it goes in. I'm looking for what's left over after I divide it. So 100 mod 3 is still 1. Now, of course, I do have a math background, so I can do these numbers fast in my head, but hopefully you guys know 99 divided by 3 can go into 99. So if 3 can go into 99, that's evenly. That means that if 100 divided by 3, I don't care how many times it goes in, but I do know that 1 is going to get left over because 99 goes in evenly, so 1 more would make 100, so my remainder is going to be 1. So hopefully that might explain the modulus. And usually with mod, if you have a grouping of 4, you might use mod 4 to put it in grouping. So another question is, when do you use this? If you have groups and you want to group things, I've seen mod being used. But other than that, mod is not being used a lot. So I wouldn't, it's not something that if you don't understand, you won't be able to program. I rarely see it, but I do see it sometimes. I had to use it in one of my programs. We were doing manual, what we call threading. So we would ask for an input of 100 different items, and the computer, as you can see here, computers can only run one thing at a time. Well, you can actually run multiple things at the same time because your computer, like my computer's a 8-core processor, so my computer can run 8 different actions at the same exact time. But if I'm running a program, it usually just narrows it down to 1 core and it just uses that one. So it just does one at a time. When you start getting into very large programs, you actually have to get into like threading, multi-threading, all that kind of stuff. And so and I was using Go language, which in Go, I can actually set the threads in there and calculate them, but I didn't want to run all of them threaded. I wanted to only run them in groups. So I wanted to run them in groups of 50. So I would actually have an iterator, and it would do a mod 50. And once it hit 0, I knew that there was 50 there. And then I could wait for those 50 to come back before I did the next. So there are times, I talked about way higher level stuff than what you need to, but just know that there are ways or reasons why you would use mod. But the number of times that I've used it is so few that don't get hung up on it. In this simple context, you know that if something divided by 2 does not give you a remainder or gives you a remainder of 0, it must be even, so you're going to push it. The other question that's what somebody was asking me, why don't I do this? So I did the push, but whenever we've been doing other things, we've set things equal at the end. And so it gets a little confusing. When do I do that? When do I not? And that's whenever I actually have to look at the push method. And again, if I just hover over it, it says that if I have an array, I can push something. I can push any number of items. We're only pushing 1 item, but it is good to know that I can push 3 or 4 or 5 items all at the same time if I want to. So any number of items. But what does it return? And this is what it returns. It returns a number. And what does that number represent? I thought it would scroll. Maybe it doesn't. Usually the return statement's at the end, but it does say here, it returns the new length of the array. So it doesn't actually return the array, it returns the length. So let's see if this actually works the way that I want to. I'm going to say I have not tried this, so hopefully it doesn't explode on me and not work. Right. And then I'm going to run this. I'm checking right now. Am I in the right directory? I am not. So I'm going to go into the right directory. Now I'm in loop exercises, which I'm in loop exercises. This is my file, which I just made a new file and called it class for examples. So I'm going to say node class for examples. And when I run this, it's giving me something error. It doesn't know what this prompt sync is. Remember at the beginning, whenever I said, hey, we need to install everything that we use, I already installed the read line sync, but I did not install this prompt sync. And it's as easy as this. I just do npm install prompt sync. It's going to install that. And then I'm going to rerun my file. And now it's running. So I know I did the install pretty fast, but definitely that's all you have to do from now on. If there's not something in there that you need, you just do npm install it and it works. So if you look here, it's printing out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. if you look here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 items. So this is doing exactly what I thought it was. When you do a push, even though we usually don't save it, and I don't need to save it, but if you wanted to save it, it is returning the size of this. So the first time it pushed, it had 1 item. The next time it pushed, it had 2 items, etc. So just going through common mistakes I've seen. The other thing that I've seen is if you put these inside the if statement or inside the for loop, it'll print it multiple times, but I don't need that. I do want to show you something cool. Let's comment this out. Okay, let's uncomment this one out. So in JavaScript, this is where JavaScript gets really weird. It has its own syntax that is not as normal in other languages. So in Java, I don't see this as much. But this thing here, if I did in my array, I could actually do a for each on my array. Again, this is advanced. Don't think you need to know this right now. But a for each, what it does, a callback function, which we haven't talked about, I'm going to throw something in there, which I'm throwing in my variable called element, and then I'm going to do some stuff to it. So right here, the element mod 2, what it's saying for each element, and this I get to change. I can say L if I want. The name of this does not matter. This is the variable that I'm using. For each element, if it gives me a 0 when I mod it, go ahead and push it to evens, else push it to odd, and then print it out. This thing does the same exact thing. So if you see, it prints out odds and scrolls too fast. There we go. There's your evens and odds. So it does the same thing. The only reason I show you this is not that you need to memorize it as much as you guys should be Googling things. If you have not been Googling things, either you know this stuff already and you don't need to, or you're not doing it the right way. Yeah, like I even Google stuff and I know how to teach this stuff. So I'm still Googling things because I can't memorize everything. So you should be Googling. The problem with Googling at your guys' level is if I said, how do I get all of these arrays? If I Googled, how do I get this array to push to my even and odds array? It might actually show you this way right here. And I don't want you to think, well, that way is wrong, because you would copy and paste it and you'd be like, that's right, it works. But on the other hand, you don't know how. Do not write code that you do not know how it works. That's what I'm telling you. That's my suggestion. Always write code that you understand. Now, if you don't understand it right now, so you paste it there and then you work through how to do it, I'm fine with that. But if you ever give code and you don't know at least the general idea on how it works, it makes everybody's life harder. If I'm trying to help you and I'm saying, if you use this, I'm assuming that you have a baseline knowledge of what this does. So then when I talk to you and I say something and you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense, it might be because you don't even have a baseline of what this even means. And then we can't talk and we can't communicate. So please try to write code that you understand, and then other people can help you understand. Right. On the other hand, if you are advanced and you do know what you're doing, please look for other ways to do this, because this is how I would see it in production. If I'm a mid-level JavaScript programmer, this is how I want it. I don't want it that other way. So just know there's other ways. Everybody has to start at the beginning, though. So please start at the beginning. Don't jump any steps. All right. I was going to do this, but I'm running out of time from what I want to do. So the question was, how do we do input validation? And this is where I was going to use that prompt, which I'm not going to do. There are multiple ways to tell if something is a string. I think the biggest question was, it doesn't matter. I don't have this right input there. The question was, how was I even supposed to know about this? Because in the code, I think it gives you that answer, in the textbook, and somebody's question to me was like, they didn't teach us what that was. And that's not a launch code problem. There are other things that I will point out where I'm like, I wish launch code did this, or I wish the textbook did this, but this is not one of them. This is an easily Googleable function. So I don't expect a textbook to be able to give you 100% information that you're going to code for the rest of your life. It's never going to happen. So if I Googled in JavaScript, how do I check if something is a number? Again, I did not do this ahead of time, so we're going to test this. And I know this is itty bitty, but you're just going to have to bear with me a little bit. How do I tell if a user gives me a number in JavaScript? And it does. First thing here, it says is none. So again, if you would have found a different way but could explain it to me, I'd be fine with that. You don't have to use this function. But what I'm telling you is if you have a problem, Google it. And of course, once you click on remember, we already talked about Mozilla, developer Mozilla is an okay source. So that's a trusted one. If you go to Stack Overflow, real quick, 2 cents here. When you go to Stack Overflow, the most common mistake as a rookie is you take this and say this is the correct answer. Does everybody know that the first bit is actually the question and not the answer? So up here, this is the wrong code. This is the wrong stuff. So make sure you're not copying and pasting that. You're going down to the answers section before you're looking at things. So even this one says is none. I know that's super hard to see on my screen, but even this one says. So Google is your friend. Please do that. If you Google it and it works and you still want more explanation on it, that's when you reach out to me and say, hey, next time in lecture, can you go over this? And that's what I did at the top of this. I commented out all the different things that I heard people wanting me to go over. So please reach out to me if you want me to go over something in detail. Right. I promised myself I would get off of here and talk to you about Studio here in about 2 minutes. So guessing game. Again, are you guys, I'm not going to actually go over this one, but if you had a guessing game and you had a secret number, you could say, while the guess is secret number, here's where somebody's question of, do I need to really initialize this guess at the beginning? And this is one that you absolutely do, because whenever I do this, when it evaluates it right here, it will actually say that guess is undefined, and it won't even check this. Like, it just skips it. So if I do the code just like this and say let guess and ask is guess equal to secret number, it'll just ignore this and it won't prompt the user. Now, if I set my guess to be anything but 7, I can do that. 0, negative, whatever. I don't care. As long as it's not the secret number, you can do this. And then lastly, the other thing you can do is do a do while. And if you do a do while, what this does is then I could do it this way if I do a do while. I don't ignore this if the syntax is wrong. I'm just talking about logic here. Whenever I hit this guess, do you see how it's not checking the guess at the beginning? It's checking it at the end. So that means that the first time it does anything with guess, it actually grabs the number that you put in. So this will work fine. So if you are doing a do while, again, you don't need to do any do whiles. You can get away and never do those. I'm just throwing out other things for you guys to think about. Right. Right. That's perfect timing. Was there, I thought there was one of these for loops that somebody wanted me to go over. No, I did the even and odds. Okay, just very briefly, I'm going to go over these because I thought some of these were interesting. I can't remember the book. No, that isn't it. Right. Print only odd numbers from this value to this value. There were two ways to do this. You could have started at an odd number and then just went up by 2. That would have worked. You could have done the module thing, went up every number and just did the modulus, and checked to see if it was 1. Maybe it was this one. Maybe this one. Can't remember. The question was, you might be right. Should this have been? Yes, it should have been not equals 2. Yeah, absolutely right. Thank you for catching that. On this thing here, this was that minus equals 2. Remember how we said there's some shortcuts? Can you do this? You absolutely can. Right. Any other? If we set the initial variable to a string, what caused the input to return as a string as well? Okay, so Josh, I don't know if this will answer your question, but anytime you use, where's one at? Anytime you use that input, it will always return a string, always. So then the question was on the whatever studio, I think it was on the studio or example, you were typing in 5,000, it technically was a string, but then whenever it checked it, it actually turned it into a number to check it, and you didn't have to actually turn it into a number. And so people were confused. It's a string, but yet it's evaluating like a number. And that's, again, because JavaScript is a loosely typed language. So it knows that some people don't think about those things. So if it's a common thing, it just does it for you. So you can't always rely on that. Can you initialize variables inside the do block? I don't know off the top of my head, but you guys can try and figure that out. I don't want to spend too much more time in lecture doing that. What I do want to spend a little bit of time in doing is going over the studio so that whenever you guys break out to the studio, you're a little bit more prepared. So I'm not going to go over the example. I'm going to talk about the tech setup of the studio. So inside Loops, you guys are going to break out into the studio here in a second. DeMarco's going to talk before you break out. And inside the studio, I just want you to start looking at the structure of this. This solution thing is a test. This is your test. You don't have to touch this, but knowing that it's there means at the end of studio, you're going to do npm space test and see if your tests work. I'm thinking about the logic. Don't read too much into that as much as if you see a spec, this is your test, so you're going to have to test it before you leave today. Again, you see how there's an index. When there's an index.js, that's the file you're going to actually run. So all of your code is going to be in this solution.js, but you're actually going to run, you're going to do node index.js to actually run it. And because there is a package, you are going to have to run npm install before you can run your file too. So again, logically, if you see a package.json, the first thing you should do is npm install. If you see an index, that's the one you're actually going to run. The other one is where your code is going to go. Right. Last thing about this, because when I read the studio and then I started doing this, the first thing that I thought of is I thought about this one thing. If you haven't read the studio, this may or may not make sense, but I'm going to hopefully explain it just enough. You are going to be assembling meals of protein, grains, veggies, etc. Okay? You can read the studio, it'll tell you more information. The one thing that I don't know if it's in the directions that I want to be very upfront about, you are going to go through arrays and throw in a protein and throw in a grain and throw in a veggie into this thing. My initial thing was, Well, how do I know which protein? How do I know which grain? How do I know which veggie? It does not matter. So you can pick the first one every single time if you want to. Not every single time. You can pick whichever one you want to. So some of you might be structured enough. On the first meal, you're just going to pick the first protein, first grain, first veggie. On the second meal, you're going to pick the second protein, second grain, second veggie. You can do that. Those of you that are really more advanced, you might ask the user input and give them a list of all of them. I would not start with that one. It would take you too much time to get studio done before the end of studio. So I'm just throwing out that suggestion. It doesn't tell you how to pick the protein, grain, or veggies. I'm just telling you for the first meal, just pick the first one in each of them. Pick the second one and the second one, etc. You could do a random number generator if you want to Google how to do that. These are all great suggestions. I just wanted to make sure that I got stuck with that one, and I wanted to tell you that if you just pick the first one and then the second one and the third one, it will pass all the tests. Everybody will be happy. Everybody will get fed. Oh, yeah. Jamarco, I haven't been looking. Are you on? I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording first.